Okay, welcome back. In a previous video, we finished creating the texture on this door. We have the door trim, the door itself, and then the door has some paneling built onto it. And if we left it just like this, you can tell that, I mean, there's definitely some direction change in some of the texture, but we want to be able to make these panels and this trim stand out just a bit from the door itself. So we're going to start by taking the raised areas, that would be the trim, and that's raised in terms of like if this was an actual door in a flat that we're getting ready to paint. But we're going to take the raised areas, this trim, and then the door panels, and we want to lighten them up just a bit. Not too much, and we also don't want to lighten them up the same amount just because we don't want them to look like they're on the same level because these panels would be a little bit of a distance away from our actual line of sight or the planes that they're on. So we're going to start with the trim. And to do so, I need to select just the trim area and create a layer that is filled with our green color and only that trim section. So with the line drawing layer selected, I'm going to use my magic wand tool and select that. And again, not going to forget to expand that selection just to make sure I am outside of the lines. And from here, I want to make sure I'm choosing the same color of this door background. You know, back when we created this background, it was probably a little bit too soon to do that because a solid full background for this was not necessarily going to ultimately be helpful, but for what we did in creating the texture on top, it was working. So now we need to separate those things out, and I'm going to create a new layer. That is the door trim background. And I'm going to fill that with that green color. Okay. So let's move this up so that it is underneath our door trim and we can see that. I'm going to turn this door background layer off for right now, just so we can see the detail that's in here. So we have our door trim background turned on, and we're going to do a little trick with the levels. We've talked about levels before, I believe, and under image and adjustments, we're going to go into the levels here. And in this, remember the histogram is going to generally show us our light versus dark pixels. Right now it's just showing 3 different lines because there's really not a lot of information on this layer right now, but we can also make some adjustments with these output levels down here. So if I bring this slider that's in the light area way down, watch and see what happens. You can see that it's making that over the whole area is a little bit darker. If I go back and then change the black slider, you can see that it makes it much lighter. So we're going to use this and lighten up our background, that green trim background, just a little bit. And it's going to be just enough, I think, to brighten that area up. I'm going to go back and turn this other layer on so that light area is not confusing us. So if we look at this, we can see now, and I'm going to deselect so we can really see the difference. You can see now that there is a definite lighter tone in this trim area than there is from the door behind it. So that's a good start. So next we want to do the panels. And I have already made a panel base. Can't tell me, it doesn't notice that it's turned off because of that green background. But I've already made this panel base. I'm going to do the same thing. Go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. Notice, and actually this is true for all, well, most of the tools, there's a shortcut. So if you learn those shortcuts, it makes things a little bit quicker to process. So in here, again, we want to lighten them up just a little bit. And we don't have to actually have it selected for this to work because it's going to apply this tone over the whole thing. And the only thing that's on this layer are those door panel pieces. Now, if I had multiple things on a single layer, this wouldn't work so well because of it would apply it to all the pixels. So if you want to have it only specific areas, then you do have to have the selection. But for right now, this will work. So I'm going to bring that up. You can see how that's already, again, made that stand out a bit. And then we have our door background, which we're actually going to, I think we'll leave it this color for now. This sort of, it ends up being darker than the panel and the trim so that it will separate from that. We don't need to make this even darker. And from here, now that we have the trim and the panels a little bit lighter, we might decide that we need to lighten the line work up just a tad as well, just because there's a little bit too much contrast in here. So we're going to do that the same way by going to our door trim layer with the texture on it now, and going to our adjustments and levels, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to lighten it up just a little bit so that the overall tone of that trim area makes sense. Do the same thing to our door panel texture. And we don't want to go too far with it, just enough to kind of make that background color make sense with the trim. And if we were actually going to be painting this, we would create that background color. We would probably do the same treatment over the whole door and then apply a glaze of a lighter color over top of these areas to give us that little bit of variation. So by changing even the line work in here, the texture within the panels, that's helping it stand out even more from that background. So that was something we want to do. And then next, we want to give these areas some definition and dimension. So that's going to involve cast shadow and maybe a highlight and shade on the object itself. So let's start with our layer styles. We've done this before in previous videos, and we'll start with our door trim again. If you double click on that area outside of your text, it brings up this layer style box, and we'll start and we'll try this bevel and emboss. Now, this is going to be problematic because, as you can see, the bevel and emboss applies the effect to any individual pixels on the screen. So if this isn't a solid finish, it's going to try to apply bevel and emboss to those lines. So this particular layer is not going to work. So let's cancel that. Let's try our door trim background. We'll do the same thing, double click, try bevel and emboss. Now this is working better. If we look at the texture on here on this particular layer, zoom in even more, you can see that highlight along the edge. And we can also try making it a little bit bigger. Now you can see that we're starting to have something of an issue because this trim layer, this background, while it's a solid color, it's still underneath my texture. So that line texture is getting obscured by the highlight on here is getting obscured by the texture from the lines. So it's working better on this particular layer because the lines tend to be going in the same direction as that bevel and emboss. When we get to do these panels and do the same technique, we're going to have a problem because of these vertical lines. So that highlight that's going to go across the top is going to be broken up by these individual lines. So just for some variation's sake, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to keep this bevel and emboss on for the door trim because I don't want a real heavy highlight on there, and I'm actually going to make this even smaller so it's a little bit less. I want a little bit of a highlight, a little bit of a shade line on that trim piece. But what I do want to add is the drop shadow. So the drop shadow then is going to create the cast shadow on these offsides. And you can change the angle by adjusting this slider. I'm going to keep it over on this quadrant for now because I think it's easier to see that way. But if depending on which light direction you want to use, you can always change that. So you can see that cast shadow now being applied over top of the brick. You can see it underneath here. We may have to do some layer adjustments for this door panel trim. It may be on top of the layer for my the door trim itself. This background, the door background is on top of, in the layer hierarchy, on top of our trim. So we're going to need to fix that. But by creating that cast shadow, if I back out, now it's really making that trim stand out nicely from there. So before we forget, let's go ahead and select both of these layers. If you hold down the Shift key, you can select more than one. And really this trim layer should be at the very top of the drawing here, because in the hierarchy in real life, it would be the closest to us, so it would be the highest point. And now you really can see that cast shadow within the door. So we're going to do a similar thing with our door panels, and we're going to choose the door panel base because we've already decided where the texture is, it's not going to work. And I'm just going to go ahead and apply this drop shadow. Now that might be a little bit much. You know, the wider the shadow is, the more it's going to make something stick up. So I don't think these panels stick up all that much from here. So I'm going to just, I like a little bit softer edge on there. That looks pretty good. But I'm not going to try to apply the bevel and emboss on this just because it is, I already know it's not going to work because of the line, the texture on there. But even so, you can really start to see that dimension coming out. So in order to do some highlight and shade along these panels so that they don't look just like, you know, solid rectangular square shapes on the door, because normally these would have some sort of trim applied or a rounded over edge or something like that. We're going to go ahead and just apply those using a paintbrush. So again, I still want to use a different layer, so I'm going to create a new layer. Oops. And we're going to call it Door Panel Highlight. Oops, if I could spell. There we go. And just to make sure I am not going to make a big mess out of this, I'm going to go ahead and make a selection to create this, because I do want the edges to have a hard edge. Not terribly big. And you know what? I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm still going to do this, but since these are all the same, I only have to do it once, and then I can copy and paste to the other side. So use here, or copy and paste to the other panels. There, and I want this to look like it's a beveled edge, so I'm actually going to subtract there and up here as well. And so I've already created my new layer, and from here I'm going to choose a highlight color. Something kind of, still want it to be kind of green, but brighter. I want it to be in the same general realm of the color. do edit, fill with my foreground color, and deselect. And because that is underneath my texture color, it shows up the lines underneath. So by moving that up, I now have that applied on top. Looks like I had a little bit of an issue with my selection here, so let's just make a tiny box around that and delete it. And when I deselect, I now have that line. So from here, since this is on its own layer, I can go in and change my blending mode. And usually for highlights, the screen mode works very well. And we can bump down the opacity so it's not quite so intense. That looks still a little bit bright. That looks pretty good. And then from here, I can just select this, and I'm going to use my magic wand tool at this point. I should be able to click on top of that, make the selection, and then if I go back to my move tool, I can hold down. Notice with this tool, if I was just to click in this area, can you see there's like an X, like almost scissors like? So I can just move that just like so, but it moves it. I wanted to make a copy of it. So put that back, close this up so we can see it better. If I hold down the Option key or the Alt key, it changes to those two arrows, which represents a duplicate. So at this point, holding that down, I can go and line it up. And thankfully, the Photoshop gives you those purple guidelines to know when you're in line. And now I have made a copy of that. If I go and add to my selection this other panel, I should be able to hold down that Option key, slide this down, make sure it's lined up, place it. And if I made a mistake, if I didn't get it quite in the right spot, you can still always just move those around separately. You just don't hold down the Option key. So once again, hold down the Option key or the Alt key. Make sure they're all lined up. And we now have highlights on our door. I'm going to do the same thing for the shade and create the overall finish here. So I'm going to go into my selection tool. And there we have it. So we have our 6 panels. They are all have a highlight and shadow and shade. And then for those paying attention as I was making my selection for my shade line here, I was definitely needing to refine that. I was just eyeballing size-wise how wide those should be, and probably that's a little bit too narrow. So the better you can be about creating that size, the better off you're going to be. If I had really known I wanted to create these panels in this way, I might have added those lines into my line drawing from Vectorworks, and in that case I would have just been able to make a selection from the line drawing to create those. So it's a little messy at this point, but it works fairly well. From here, if I was truly doing this as a trompe-l'oeil painting, I would likely add a zinger highlight on the edge, maybe some cut lines, but because this for me is a actual panel door, I don't really need to do that because for the most part those things are going to show up like that because it's actually a three-dimensional door. So they'll take the light the way they should. It's just nice to add those elements in there for the paint elevation purpose so that you can then see the different panels in the door. If you've got it too intense, if there's too, if you feel like that highlight is too bright, you can always go back and use your opacity and tone it down a little bit more. In fact, I think that's probably a good idea. And also I use the multiply blending mode for the shade because again, I want to be able to see that texture come through there. An alternate way to add a bevel and highlight and shade to the layers here just occurred to me in that we could always merge these layers together to create the bevel and emboss on there. Now the only issue with doing that is once you have merged them together, they're not going to be editable the same way. Maybe a problem, maybe not, but just always be sure that you've got the look the way you want it to be before you would do something like this. So in order to show you how that would look is if we take our door trim again, and previously we have added the background, the bevel and emboss to this background layer. I'm going to turn these off just so that that doesn't affect what we do here. Select both of these layers and I'm going to merge them so they're going to become one layer, so the trim itself is not going to be separate from the background. That line texture is not going to be separate. So if I right click on those with those both selected, choose this merge layers function, so now that is one single layer. If I turn it off, it goes right back to that door background color that we had previously. From here, then I could add my bevel and emboss function. So if I zoom in so you can see the effect, if I choose bevel and emboss, now you can see the effect on here. It's a little bit funky around the brick for some reason. There may be the way it's selected, the way it's filled in, not 100% sure, but we do have some controls over here that can maybe make it a little bit better. So under the style for the bevel and emboss, we can change, well, I'll show you what some of these do. So the outer bevel is going to put it on the outside. Inner bevel is what we just looked at. Emboss, that's kind of half and half. That's not there yet. Pillow emboss, that's putting a highlight below. Stroke emboss, there's hardly any visible thing. So probably inner bevel for this one makes the most sense. And we can also change some of these, the technique, smooth, chisel hard, chisel soft. So smooth looks pretty good. So I'm gonna hold it there and I can change the size. Again, I don't want it to be a real strong look, and I can soften the edges just a little bit, make it not quite so distinct. But now because that line work is on the same layer as my background, that bevel and emboss is showing up a lot better. Remember, you can always change the different settings. The gloss contour sometimes is fun to play with. You can change the look pretty dramatically by choosing some of these different things. Most of the time I go and play with those settings and end up going back to the original one anyways. And you can change the opacity, so finding that screen a little bit too hot, so I'm going to bring that opacity down just a tinge, and I think I actually want the shade to be a little stronger. And then not to forget the drop shadow, because the drop shadow is really what helps us separate that trim from the background. And the bigger my shadow, the farther the distance is going to appear on there. Soften it up just a little bit. You don't want to soften it too hard because you want, cast shadows typically have a pretty clean edge. So just be aware of that if you're trying to create something that looks fairly realistic. And so our result is pretty close to what we had before. Now I could have done the same thing with the panels, but for now I'm going to leave those alone. So I kind of like the result for how that coloring came out. If we feel like that highlight is too white on there, especially compared to my highlight on my panels, we can always go back, double click, and change that screen color. Let's see, it was this color I think was my original, what I used. So just by going back, changing the color, it's still in the same mode as what I changed my panel highlight to. So that works pretty well. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see now those two highlights match each other and it makes a lot more sense. So options. There's always going to be different ways to do similar things, especially in Photoshop and some of these programs. So part of the process is figuring out how the tools work and how they are going to affect what you're doing. And you do what works for you, ultimately.